Since we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about trauma, we probably need to figure out what exactly is trauma. Oddly enough, there's lots of debate over the definitions of trauma. There's even more discussions on what symptoms make up PTSD. The handouts on our site for PTSD and disorders of extreme stress have the two most common ways that people will look at the impact of trauma. Most everyone agrees that trauma comes from situations where your life is in immediate danger. Trauma can also come from being close to someone who's had this kind of danger happen to them. And sometimes trauma comes from watching other people have trauma happen to them. As we'll see, extreme danger is in the mind of the beholder. What's trauma to one person may not even seem like a big deal to somebody else. Our sense of danger is usually based on our history and our experiences. Very few events will impact everybody the same. After these traumatic events, the person continues to be constantly reminded of the event with intruding thoughts and pictures and images of what happened to them. Often called flashbacks, they come in like pictures with images that have smells and sounds and other sensations that feel so real it's like the event is still happening. The idea that the past still feels like the present is one of the major things that helps define something as traumatic. Sometimes, the memories happen when we're sleeping in the form of nightmares. The nightmares don't have to be exactly what happened to us. They can be like the trauma and remind us of how we felt when it happened. One example is someone who was sexually assaulted on a regular basis may have dreams of monsters chasing them around the room at night. Nightmares can be a real problem, especially when they interfere with sleep on a regular basis. If survivors start to expect nightmares, they'll sometimes try anything possible to stay awake in order to avoid the nightmares. Over time, being sleep deprived begins to create other problems with concentration and with energy. Survivors tend to avoid the thoughts and sensations and memories of their traumas. When they can, they avoid going near where it happened, they won't talk about it, and they'll stay away from any activity that might remind them of what happened to them. Sadly, triggers and reminders seem to exist everywhere, and avoidance becomes all but impossible no matter how hard the survivor tries. Eventually, survivors begin to shut down or numb the emotions related to the trauma. Unfortunately, we can't just selectively numb a single negative emotion. We have to start shutting them all down at the same time. This robs us of positive emotions like joy and love or any kind of excitement about life. Avoidance can lead to unhealthy distractions like smoking or drinking or using some other kinds of drugs. Another form of avoidance or numbing can be unhealthy distractions. Sometimes these distractions look like high-risk behaviors, things like frequent or random sex, stealing or shoplifting, violence, spending a lot of money that you don't have, and other kinds of damaging behaviors. All along, survivors' emotions can become extremely hard to control. Most survivors report lots of rapid and confusing mood swings or feeling trapped in the emotions of their trauma experiences. This usually leads to negative thoughts and beliefs that the survivor will have about him or herself. This often limits their ability to enjoy just about anything that used to feel like it was fun. Eventually, these thoughts and beliefs can develop into a long-term sense of being detached, isolated, and out of place. Lastly, survivors are in a constant state of being aroused or activated. Falling asleep becomes difficult due to inabilities to calm themselves, like their minds or their bodies. The combination of constant arousal and little sleep leads to being grumpy and lots of outbursts of anger. Many survivors struggle to concentrate. There's a constant scanning of everything that goes on around them and being really easily startled or jumpy. This happens a lot in public. This can lead to a diagnosis of ADHD or attention deficit disorder. I personally believe it's just the opposite. I believe it's attention surplus disorder. Survivors stay so busy trying to pay attention to everything that's going on in their environment, as well as trying to keep up with their triggers and reminders so that they stay in check, they don't get a chance to filter in information that's important. It starts to look like they're not paying attention. This can be really important for caregivers and parents of kids who are victims of child abuse. It can be the beginning of a long string of misdiagnosed mental health issues and a lot of different drugs that could have been avoided if the real issue of trauma was addressed. While the above are the standard criteria for identifying PTSD, they still don't really tell us what a traumatic event is. And this is where we have to make distinctions using medical and biological research, as well as lots of information from therapists around the world who are experts in treating PTSD. If we use their criteria, we can land on the following as essential components for trauma. First, the person gets confronted by a situation that completely overwhelms their thoughts, their feelings, and their bodies. Second, the person experiences a complete sense of terror and helplessness with no chance to escape. This feeling of being trapped and disconnected from others remains after the event's passed. This leads to a constant state of terror and sometimes a sense of disgust that leaves them feeling frozen in the moment. If the emotions and body sensations and urges don't get a chance to be released in the moments that immediately follow a traumatic event, PTSD is probably going to emerge. Keep in mind that this is an example of only one event. We know from research that most victims of trauma, especially complex developmental trauma, with physical or sexual abuse, they happen many times. Each time these events occur, there's an increasing impact on the victim, trying to withstand all of the body sensations and their biology. This has a long-lasting effect on physical and mental health. So what types of events can create these overwhelming feelings? We're all familiar with major catastrophic events like natural disasters or war or terrorism. And most people can agree that physical and sexual assault and abuse are traumatic events. As researchers continue to study trauma, we're more and more aware of other events in the home that can interrupt healthy development. This can include someone in the home with alcohol issues or mental illness, having a caregiver or a family member with chronic illness or pain, witnessing or hearing violence between your parents or between your siblings, or between your parents and your siblings. Someone being taken from the home by the police, community violence in a neighborhood, emotional and verbal abuse, as well as neglect where basic needs like food and hygiene aren't being met. These are all events that researchers believe leads to negative health outcomes when people are adults. What about bullying? This is a huge issue and leads to widespread sense of helplessness in kids and might be the #1 factor leading to adolescent suicides. What about undiagnosed learning and developmental delays, where kids are accused of simply not trying when in fact they just can't do it? I suggest that having to face this day after day with the hopeless expectation of never succeeding constitutes helplessness and feeling trapped with no escape. What about bullying in the workplace? Constant ridicule by bosses or coworkers, where any type of retaliation has the potential to cost you your job and ability to earn a living, seems pretty traumatic to me. How about underemployment or chronic poverty? Do they count as trauma? Things can be very different if we start to consider third world cultures and what they experience. If you visited a third world country, you're aware of even the secondhand trauma you can experience just by witnessing the challenges and struggles occurring on a daily basis for them. It's hard to imagine what the ongoing sense of trauma is for people in these types of countries. Sometimes we have to think about identifying small and large T trauma. Large T is pretty easy to identify. Small t is not so evident, and yet is usually more the constant experience for people. The cumulative impact of these small traumas may actually be more detrimental than the less frequent and more identifiable larger ones. What other ideas can you think of regarding what constitutes traumatic experiences? What types of experiences might be contributing to your situation? There's a detailed and very comprehensive traumatic antecedents questionnaire available on our website that was developed by Bessel van der Kolk. This may help you to consider some other ideas about trauma you would have otherwise overlooked. As we look back over the information, some of the important ideas to remember about trauma are, number one, trauma comes from feeling like we're in danger and we can't get away. Danger can feel different for everyone. Trauma is all about the memories that interrupt your life in some way or another. We try to find ways to avoid remembering the traumas that have happened to us. Unfortunately, reminders of our trauma are everywhere. Trauma leads to being constantly on guard wherever you are, which makes it hard to sleep, concentrate, relax, stay calm, or feel safe. Trauma lives in your body and in the actions that we couldn't complete during that event. Trauma can be big T or little t trauma events. Little t trauma events can actually be more damaging than the big T events because they happen over and over and over again. Now that we have a better idea of what trauma looks like, let's turn to theories on what happens in trauma. Let's take a look at what seems to create so many of these difficult lifelong struggles.